I'm going to tell you tonight about something that's been on my mind lately. I am a firm believer that things in our lives don't happen by accident. Now, that isn't to say that we can't make choices that will put us in a situation where accidents might happen. But even if we choose correctly, there are things that come into our lives that are not quite like they should be, and we understand that right off the bat, and we sense it, and we don't like the feeling. And it's easy to dismiss those things and say, God doesn't care about me, or he wouldn't let those kind of things happen to me. And that's a dangerous thought. It's very dismissive of God and all of his omniscience and omnipotence, his omnipresence in our lives. And I haven't got time here tonight to explain how I've settled all that in my mind as to the reality of all that. Not that I understand it perfectly, but I've come to grips with a lot of things. When I was going to say a youngster, but I would have been a little older than that. Youngster sometimes applies to people that might be 10 or 11 years old, and I was probably 14 or 15 by now, and I had these experiences, and I've thought a lot about them because I've seen some correlation between what I'm about to tell you and life in general. Let me tell you. So I've already explained that I grew up on a farm, and my dad trusted me to do, especially as I got a little older, trusted me to run the tractor and the machinery, and he taught me how to do various things, and he had to work at what we called the Bear Lake Co-op. It was a creamery just north of Paris, and that was his day job. And then he did water mastering and milked cows at night, so he didn't have time for a lot of things, and whatever he could get to me to do, which I was usually quite willing and anxious to help and learn things as I did the work. I'd always feel good when I could look back over a field, for example, after I'd plowed it, and see that especially if I plowed it well, and look back over that field and see all of the furrows turned nicely, and if I could make it straight, that was always a bonus. And I learned how to do that. One of the things my father asked me to do that always troubled me, was he would ask me to get on the tractor and hook it up to the swather. For those of you that don't know what a swather is, it's you pull it behind the tractor off the power takeoff, and it runs a machine that has a knife down close to the ground, and it feeds the hay into the machine, and the knife cuts it off, and it comes back out the back in a kind of a windrow. It was actually quite a remarkable invention in its day, because before that we had to cut the hay and let it dry, and then use rakes and bunch it up, and then use push rakes and push it into piles, and then we'd put it up loose. But with a swather, you could do all of that with one pass, and one machine, and one person. And it was fairly simple as long as the machinery would run. Well, back to this job that I didn't like to do. Some days my father would come out and he'd say, "It's time to cut the dry farm." Well, we didn't have a dry farm on our farm, but we had leased a farm from a neighbor. My dad did quite a little of that to try to get enough hay for our dairy herd. Dairy cows eat more hay than like beef animals and so forth. So he wanted to make sure that we had enough hay to get us through the winter, and he'd lease people's farms. Well, this one person's farm that he left had a dry farm, and it was a dry farm alfalfa. It was mostly alfalfa, a little grass. There's always a few weeds to get in the mix, but the reason I always had a real problem taking on that assignment is because he would leave these instructions. Bless my dad. I finally told him what the problem was, but he would say, today, looks like the weather's going to be good this week. I think we can put the dry farm hay up and it's ready. He always wanted to make sure it was ready, because if the blossoms were too far along, the quality of the alfalfa wasn't as good, and the cows, when they ate it, wouldn't produce as well. If you got it in what he called the early blossom stage, or the bud stage was even better, then when you cut the hay, there would be more protein in it, and when the cows ate it, they would milk better. So there was kind of a right and a wrong way to go about things. And he taught me that, and I respected him for it. He didn't haphazardly go about things. He knew that if he was going to maximize the benefit from having a farm, he had to make correct decisions. Well, part of those decisions fell on my shoulders when it came to cutting the dry farm. Now, let me explain why cutting the dry farm was problematic for me, because he would always say, it's time to cut the dry farm today, but don't break any sections. And some of you right now are saying, well, what's a section? Well, a section was in the knife bar. In fact, that's what a knife bar was made up of, is a bunch of sections, little triangular knife-like things that you'd put on a bar and inserted about a 10-foot or 12-foot length of it into the swather where it was touching the ground, and it went between what we call guards, hay guards. The guards would guard the section knife, and the section knife was sharp when we started. Always, we tried to make sure that it was sharp, because a dull section knife was never good for cutting hay. As you can imagine, anything that needs to be cut with something sharp. So he would say, don't break any sections. Well, the reason he said that was because that dry farm alfalfa field was filled with rocks. I mean, it had been planted, so it had been plowed, we know that, but there was just rocks everywhere, it seemed like. Not big rocks, but just rocks that had worked themselves up because the ground was rocky to begin with, and when it had gone through a winter or two, the rocks seemed to work up to the surface and the frost and push them up. And there were just rocks in that field, and he'd say, go cut the alfalfa on the dry farm today, but don't break any sections. Well, I tried that a time or two, and I could never do it. It seemed like every time I went up there, I could do hardly anything but break sections, because that's what I was riveted on not doing. I just broke sections out. Well, let me explain what a broken section does to a hayfield. When the cutting bar, we used to call it, that had the sections on it, had a broken section on it, then when you'd pull the swather along, that little part of hay that was right there where that section knife that was broken was supposed to cut, it wouldn't cut it. It just bent it over and looked raggy when you looked back. So it was easy to tell easy to tell when you had a broken section, because all you'd have to do is look behind you and you could see the raggedy path of the hay that was supposed to have been cut by that broken section that now never got cut. So if you can just imagine what a field looked like when you went very far without or with a broken section. It was really difficult and time-consuming to stop and take the section knives out and go find the right instruments and the anvils and hammers and rivets and everything to put a section back in, and hammer the rivets down and make sure that it was fitting snug, and then hammer the other rivet down on the other side. Make sure that you had that new section tight so it wouldn't jiggle loose and break right off the bat against one of the guards that was supposed to be guarding it as it went back and forth in the swather. So I don't know if I painted a very good picture for you there or not. Sometimes the section that would be broken would be right where the windrow would come out of the swather. So you'd look back and you'd think everything was being cut just fine, but then you start to see, if you look very carefully, you start to see this raggedy part, or see the swather row kind of bunched up because underneath that hay that was kicking out, there was this strip of hay that hadn't been cut because the section was directly in front of where that windrow was on the cutter bar. Well, I don't know how much of it in detail I want to get there, but I wanted to go into a little detail because there were times when I first started, and maybe this is why he told me don't break any sections, because when I first started cutting the field, like the previous year, I'm sure he told me the same thing, but I didn't pay any attention much. And I just cut the hay, and if there was a section out, I'd look at the knife and it would only be partly broken. And yeah, it left kind of a raggedy part on the ground behind the swather as I passed over it, but I kept reasoning to myself, well, it's not going to be too bad. I mean, I'm getting most of the hay, just a little bit there that I'm not getting. And so I'd get back on the tractor and drive along and cut the hay until pretty soon I noticed another spot where the hay was doing the same thing. Well, what had happened is another section had been broken out. And that very first year, I just got so annoyed because I wasn't about to pull that knife out every time and change the section. I couldn't do that. Hay had to be cut, so I just kept going. Well, when I got done, I looked back over the field. It was a mess because some of those swather on the cutting bar, there were like 4 or 5 sections broken out. So it was like just a strip of raggy marks in the field where those sections were broken and should have been changed, but weren't, because I was too lazy to take the time to do all of that. And besides, I rationalized that it didn't really matter all that much. But then when I got the field all cut and I looked back over it, I thought, oh my, it did matter. I should never have done that. Well, the next year, I had told my dad earlier, I said, no, I can't cut that field without losing sections. Don't tell me to go mow the dry farm and not break any sections, because I can't do it. It just happens up there. It's like telling me, go mow the dry farm and miss all the rocks. It's impossible. You can't do that. And I tried to convince him, but he wasn't going to have a raggedy looking field. And besides that, he needed the hay. So we butted heads, I guess, a little bit over that. Nothing serious. But I kind of told him, I said, don't tell me to do something that I can't do. You know I can't do it. You couldn't do it either. And I remember saying that to him. Like I said, kind of butted heads a little bit. Well, my dad was always wanting to find a solution to things, so he went over to his friend over at Jensen Wood Motor in Montpelier, which is where we buy the swathers from. And they had a tool over there that they sold that you could change out the sections while it was still on the cutter bar in the swather. You had to get a hammer and a chisel and a punch and get all the old section knocked out and punch the rivet holes clear so that had the rivets in them. You had to punch those out so that there would be room for the new rivets that you put in. And there was an art to putting those sections in while it was still there. You had to get the knife positioned just right. And then this tool was such that if you put the bottom of it under the section and the top of it on top of the section, and then had the rivet in place between the two parts of the tool, and then there was a place where you'd tighten it down with a wrench. Now it sounds like you had to have a lot of hands to do that, and you did kind of, but eventually you figured it out so if you positioned everything just right, it would work out. And so I tried it a time or two. It didn't work so well. I had to start all over with the section replacement. But eventually, with a little practice, I learned how to change out a section while it was still in the swather. And so when I plowed the field now, with that section having been changed out, all you would see is just a little place behind the swather where I first noticed the section out. It was maybe a raggedy piece in the field that was only a few feet long, 6 or 8 feet long. And if I kept a good eye on the cutter bar, I could tell when I was having a problem and when the hay was balling up a little bit and it wasn't falling into the cutter bar just like it should. You could tell. So it all came with experience. But I'd put that tool on and I could cinch those rivets onto that section and fix it. Well, that didn't take the rocks out of the field. And I still broke sections. And the sections were actually fairly expensive to buy. But I figured if my dad wants to lease ground that's got rocks in it, then he's got to bear the expense of some sections, especially if he wants me to replace them every time one goes out. So I spend a lot of time crawling in and out from under that cutting bar on that swather, changing out sections whenever I was assigned to mow the dry farm. And I still told him, you can't mow the dry farm and not break sections. And finally, he says, I think you can. I says, the only way you can do that is to raise the cutter bar up so that it slides over the rocks. The problem with that is then you didn't get the hay down close, so either way you missed out on hay that you should have cut that you didn't. And I tried to explain that to him. Anyway, he felt good about buying this tool, and I learned how to use it. Eventually, we solved the problem. So there's ways of solving problems before you make a mess of the field. And sometimes it takes a while to learn it, but you can solve them. There was another experience that I'll tell you about too that was similar, because we're back to the swathing again. But this time it wasn't up on the dry farm, it was down in the meadow. There was one place down in the meadow that was boggy. By that I mean there was sod there, and there was grass, and everything looked just fine until you were made enough rounds around the field that you started to get closer and closer to the center of that bog. And then you started to notice something. The first thing you notice is that your tractor wheels are starting to get wet. And you keep mowing and get out onto the dry part of the field. And by the time you come around to that part again, you go across it and your tractor wheels would be wet. The next thing you'd notice is you went around and around the field, kept getting closer to the center of that bog hole, I'll call it, a place where it was really wet. The sod in the field, it was strange because the sod was thick and it started to wave. I'm not talking about wave like you wave to somebody in a car, but it started to roll, I guess is a better term. It started to roll when the tractor went over it, and you kind of sense that it was almost like riding on a wave, a gentle wave on the lake or a pond or something. It's just a gentle rolling motion as the tractor would go over it, and the wheels would get wetter and wetter, even the front wheels, and I always used to kind of hold my breath, because there had been a time or two when I did that, when my dad had given me similar instructions. He would say, "Go mow the south field today." The south field was the one that had the bog hole in it up in the meadow on another farm that we leased. And he would say, mow the south field today, and please don't get the tractor stuck. Well, as soon as he'd say that, I said, yeah, kind of like mow the dry farm and don't break any sections. It's not that easy. And I got the tractor stuck there once. And the only way you can get him out when it's in the bog hole like that, because if you bring something else in, you just get it stuck too. You'd have to get a big long chain or some heavy duty cable and hook it up to another tractor or something that could pull you out, depending on how deep you got in there. And I can remember my dad once trying to get me out with some ingenuity, that he'd put some logs by the wheels and tie them on the wheel frame and try to get the tractor to kind of pull itself out. But it was a little dangerous doing that. But it worked. But his instructions were, mow the south field and don't get the tractor stuck, as he left the house in the morning. And I was sometimes almost petrified before I got that pond, or I should call it a pond, that bog hole area mowed. And by the way, I soon learned that you could only mow so much of it. I certainly learned that don't even try to mow up to the very center, because you will get stuck. So I'd risk it just as far as I could risk it. I'd take my chances until I didn't dare take any more chances, and then that part of the meadow, and it wasn't very big, but it was maybe an area that was 10 yards by 20 yards or something like that, maybe 15 yards by 20 yards, that you'd finally just have to leave. But the idea was to get enough of it cut so that if you left some, it wasn't very much. Otherwise, it was even harder to get the next year, because it had all that dried grass down in there, and it was even harder. Well, I'm not going to go much more, and I'm going to tell you any more stories like that, though I could. There are other circumstances, but I've run those back through my mind, and thinking, if you maybe you'll identify with it, but have you ever had to do something when you knew you were going to make a mistake? Some of my girls have played volleyball. Well, when you play volleyball, it's set, and then or bump, set, and then spike, 3 hits. And those hits, if they're not done almost perfectly, will come back to haunt you because the other team will get a chance to do it. And I've sat and watched my girls play that. Some of the earlier ones didn't get quite as sophisticated, but it seemed like the game just got more sophisticated as the younger ones came along. It was bump, set, spike. And I couldn't help but notice that it was pretty hard. I mean, you could do that several times in a row, but to play a game when you bump that first hard hit serve and tried to make it go straight up and soften it up so the next person could set it over to the spiker and all that, and had to be so high and so far away from the net and all that. It's pretty sophisticated if you watch volleyball. It's almost impossible to play a volleyball. In fact, it is impossible to play a perfect volleyball game. And it was impossible for me. I should have taken my dad to some volleyball, but it was impossible for me to swath the dry farm and not get any sections broken. And it was pretty hard for me to cut the south field swamp and not get stuck. So in those situations, as with volleyball and probably a lot of other things in life, you do the very best you can. And as I learned how to change sections on the swather, the field that I mowed the second year was a whole lot nicer looking than the field I mowed the first year. And it even got better the next year because I learned how to change the sections better. But I never did mow that field that I can think of when I didn't break a section. Well, if I just said, I'm going to break a section if I go up there and I refuse to do it and the hay didn't get cut, then the cows would have gone without feed and we wouldn't have got the milk that we needed to live on, yada, yada, yada. It's just that in life, sometimes you have to do the best that you can and not really worry so much about it being perfect. Not really worrying so much about breaking a section. Not really worrying so much about getting stuck. Just apply the correct principles that you know and have learned and you get better at. Apply them. And yeah, you might eventually, you're going to maybe break a section. You might even get stuck. But you'll get better at it as you go. I know that. My mother used to say this. I'm always quoting my mother. She would say, things that you persist in doing, you get better at. Not that the nature of the thing has changed, but that your ability to do it has increased. Well, that applies to rocky dry farm alfalfa cutting and bog swathing and volleyball, and I think in particular relationships. Think about it. Relationships are some of the most difficult things to nurture along and make perfect. There's always going to be a rough spot. And so what you have to do is try to avoid the rough spots. Do what you can to avoid the rocks. But when they break a section out, when you lose your temper, find a way to fix it. Put that tool on the section knife and cinch the rivets down and try again. And when that bog hole that you didn't dare get quite close enough to, and eventually you got too close and it sunk in, you pushed your luck a little bit too much in a relationship, so to speak, and a wheel dropped, and then you figure it out. First of all, you figure out how to get yourself out of the muck. And you do that quite often in relationships, by a truly sincere apology. And then in analyzing what went wrong, how it went wrong, what caused you to react the way you did. And then don't do it again. Easier said than done, right? It is, just like volleyball playing, easier said than done. But if you just keep working on it, if you polish it off, if you chip away at the rough corners of your relationships, you'll find out that pretty soon they get smoother and smoother. Eventually, those relationships rarely, if ever, have a rough spot in them. I've not been there yet, but I've heard of people. Unless they lied, I don't know. But I always thought it was a lofty goal and one that I should work towards, because I have a lot of imperfections, and some people get upset at me over things, and I can't see what I've done. And then when I start analyzing a little closer, I can see some things that I could have made better. The problem is that sometimes you do like I did with the alfalfa dry farm piece. You just leave the broken section broken and try to cut the field with a broken, until when you're done, all you got's a raggedy old looking dry farm piece with a little hay scattered all over it that wasn't cut properly. And it looks bad, and that part that was run over without being cut properly won't feed the cows next winter. So take care of your relationships. They are amongst the most rocky dry farms and boggy fields that you will ever have to deal with. That's been my experience, but I know the process. And so I'm passing that on to you so that you might know the process too, and have a commitment. That's the main thing, and have a commitment that you're going to do it, that you're not going to fail, and that if you make a mistake today, you won't make the same one tomorrow. And if you keep taking that approach, things will be just fine. It always pays to ask for forgiveness and show sincere repentance, and then recommit and figure it out. Ask the Lord to help you. It works. Do you believe me? Or have you gone to sleep? Good night either way. Love you.